The British column, meanwhile, was discovering that their secret mission was secret no longer. Lieutenant Colonel Smith's advance guard, led by Major John Pitcairn of the Royal Marines, began encountering suspicious characters on the road. Signal fires blazed from hilltops, and the sound of alarm bells echoed across the countryside. Research from the Boston Public Library's archives reveals that the British had seriously underestimated the colonial intelligence network. What they had planned as a swift, surgical strike was becoming a running battle against an aroused population. Every mile they marched took them deeper into hostile territory, where every farmhouse might hide a sniper, and every bend in the road might conceal an ambush. William Dawes, taking the southern route, was having his own adventures. The Boston Neck was heavily guarded, but the tanner's son had spent his youth learning every path and byway around the city. He talked his way past British sentries with a combination of bluff and bravado, then rode hard to catch up with Revere's northern route. By 2 a.m, both messengers had reached Lexington, where they found the town militia already assembling on the village green. Captain John Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War, was calling his men to arms. The British regulars were still hours away, but the colonists were already preparing to make their stand. The night was no longer dark and quiet. From Lexington to Concord and beyond, the countryside was alive with activity. Messengers rode in all directions, carrying the alarm to distant towns. Militia companies were forming up, checking their weapons and preparing for battle. The British had hoped to achieve surprise, but they were about to face an enemy that had been expecting them for months. The first gray light of dawn on April 19th revealed a sight that would have chilled the blood of any British officer who could have seen it. Across the Massachusetts countryside, columns of armed men were converging on the roads leading to Lexington and Concord. The alarm had spread through the night like wildfire, and now the countryside was responding with a fury that the British had never anticipated. On Lexington Green, Captain John Parker stood with his company of Minutemen, 77 farmers and tradesmen who had answered the call to arms. The village common was a rough triangle of grass in the center of town, bordered by the Meeting House, Buckman Tavern, and several houses. It was here that the men of Lexington had drilled throughout the winter, preparing for this moment. Parker was a 45-year-old veteran of the Siege of Louisbourg and the French and Indian War. He had fought alongside British regulars in those conflicts, and he knew their tactics and capabilities. But he also knew that his own men were fighting for their homes and families, which could make ordinary farmers into extraordinary soldiers. The British advance guard, led by Major John Pitcairn, was now less than a mile away. The 6 light infantry companies moved in perfect formation, their redcoats bright in the morning sun, their bayonets gleaming. They were professional soldiers trained in the rigid discipline of 18th-century warfare, confident in their ability to scatter any colonial resistance. As the British approached the green, Parker faced an impossible decision. His men were outnumbered 10-1, and they had no artillery or cavalry support. Some of his Minutemen were already having second thoughts, slipping away toward the woods behind the meeting house. Those who remained stood in a ragged line, their muskets loaded but not yet raised. "Stand your ground," Parker told his men, his voice carrying across the green. "Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Major Pitcairn rode onto the green with his advance companies, expecting to find the militia already dispersed. Instead, he saw a line of determined men who showed no signs of backing down. The British major was an experienced officer who had served in the American colonies before, and he understood the delicate nature of the situation. "Disperse the rebels," Pitcairn shouted, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Lay down your arms." British soldiers moved into line formation, their muskets loaded and ready. The morning sun cast long shadows across the green, and for a moment time seemed suspended. Some of the Lexington men began to drift away, unwilling to face the overwhelming British force. But others remained, their weapons still in their hands. The tension was unbearable. 2 groups of armed men facing each other across a few yards of grass, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, came the crack of a musket. To this day, historians debate who fired that first shot. British accounts claimed it came from the American side, while colonial witnesses insisted it was fired by a British soldier. What mattered was not who fired, but what happened next. The first shot broke the spell that had held both sides frozen. British soldiers, trained to respond instantly to the sound of gunfire, began firing without orders. The ragged volley echoed across the green, and several of the Lexington men fell to the ground. Historical records from the Lexington Historical Society document the casualties of that first exchange. 8 Americans died on the green that morning, including Jonas Parker, the captain's cousin, Harrington, who crawled to his own doorstep before dying in his wife's arms. 10 others were wounded before the survivors scattered into the woods. The British had achieved their immediate tactical objective. The green was cleared of armed resistance, but strategically they had made a fatal error. The shots fired at Lexington Green would echo throughout the 13 colonies, providing the spark that would ignite the American Revolution. Major Pitcairn reformed his companies and prepared to continue the march to Concord, unaware that he had just witnessed the birth of a new nation. As the British column moved on toward Concord, leaving behind the bodies of the dead Americans, the surviving Minutemen began to regroup in the woods. The war had begun, and there would be no turning back. The British column reformed quickly after the brief engagement at Lexington Green. But the professional soldiers were beginning to understand that this would be no ordinary march. As they moved west toward Concord, the countryside around them was alive with activity. Militia companies were converging from every direction, moving through the woods and fields that paralleled the main road. Colonel Johann Gottlob Raoul commanded the Trenton garrison with the confidence of a professional soldier who had never known defeat on American soil. The 49-year-old Hessian veteran had earned his reputation fighting for Frederick the Great in the 7 Years' War, where European armies moved with clockwork precision across familiar battlefields. In his mind, the ragged Continental Army posed no more threat than a pack of unruly peasants armed with hunting rifles and revolutionary dreams. The 1,400 Hessian troops under Rahl's command represented some of Europe's most disciplined fighting men. The Rahl Regiment, the Losberg Regiment, and the Nifosan Regiment had been trained from childhood in the rigid traditions of Prussian military doctrine. Their bright uniforms, precise drill formations, and unwavering obedience to orders had made them the most sought-after mercenaries in Europe. King George III had paid handsomely for their services, confident that German professionalism would quickly crush American amateur enthusiasm. Christmas night had unfolded exactly as Raoul expected, in a civilized garrison town. The officers had gathered for dinner and cards in Rahl's quarters above Abraham Hunt's tavern, while the enlisted men celebrated with their traditional holiday rations of rum and beer. The colonel himself had consumed considerable quantities of both wine and brandy, confident that no enemy would be foolish enough to launch an attack in such weather. When a local Tory farmer had arrived around midnight with warnings of Continental Army movement, Raoul had dismissed the report as the nervous imagination of a colonial sympathizer seeking attention. The Hessian defensive positions reflected European military thinking that had little relevance to American conditions. Raoul had positioned his men to defend against formal siege tactics, with artillery covering the main approaches and infantry formations designed to repel frontal assaults across open ground. The concept of rapid movement through difficult terrain, followed by coordinated attacks from multiple directions, simply did not exist in the Hessian tactical manual. Their sentries were posted to watch for conventional military approaches, not for desperate men emerging from a winter storm like avenging spirits. Lieutenant Andreas Wiederholt commanded the outpost guards on the Pennington Road, the northern approach to Trenton. His small detachment of 20 men had spent the night huddled in a cobbler's shop, emerging only occasionally to peer through the driving sleet for signs of enemy activity. The storm had reduced visibility to less than 50 yards, making effective surveillance nearly impossible. When Wiederholt's sentries finally spotted movement in the gray dawn light, they initially mistook the approaching Continental Army for a patrol of their own men returning from reconnaissance. The fatal delay lasted only minutes, but those minutes would determine the outcome of the entire engagement. By the time Wiederholt realized that the figures emerging from the storm were American soldiers, not Hessian troops, Washington's advance guard was already within musket range of the outpost. The young lieutenant managed to fire a single warning shot before retreating toward the town center, but his small force was quickly overwhelmed by Captain William Washington's cavalry and a company of Virginia riflemen under Captain John Stark. Inside Trenton itself, the Hessian garrison awakened to chaos that their training had never prepared them to handle. The sound of gunfire from the outposts mingled with shouted orders in English, creating confusion that spread through the ranks like wildfire. Sergeants who had drilled their men in parade ground formations found themselves trying to organize a defense against an enemy that seemed to materialize from every direction at once. The rigid command structure that worked so effectively in European warfare began to collapse under the pressure of unexpected circumstances. Colonel Raoul himself emerged from his quarters in a state of considerable confusion, still wearing his dress uniform from the previous evening's celebrations, according to eyewitness accounts later published in the New York Mercury. The Hessian commander initially believed he was facing a minor raid that could be easily repelled by a show of disciplined force. The possibility that Washington had successfully crossed the Delaware with his entire army in the middle of a winter storm simply did not occur to a professional soldier, trained to think in terms of conventional military possibilities rather than desperate revolutionary necessities. The battle for Trenton erupted with the fury of men who knew they were fighting for the survival of their cause. General Sullivan's column struck from the south along the river road, while Greene's division hammered into the town from the north, catching the Hessians in a deadly crossfire that shattered their attempts at organized resistance. The narrow streets of the colonial town became a maze of confusion and terror as disciplined European soldiers found themselves trapped in a nightmare of American innovation and desperation. Captain Alexander Hamilton's artillery battery wheeled into position at the head of King Street, the main thoroughfare bisecting Trenton from north to south. The young West Indian, barely 20 years old, had positioned his guns with mathematical precision to command the entire length of the street. When the Hessian artillery crews attempted to bring their own cannons to bear, Hamilton's well-trained gunners swept them away with devastating volleys of grapeshot that turned the cobblestones crimson with blood and littered the roadway with the bodies of Europe's finest soldiers. The Raoul Regiment, awakened from their Christmas slumber by the sound of American guns, attempted to form their traditional battle lines in the town square. These men had drilled for years in the precise movements that made European armies invincible on conventional battlefields. But the confined spaces of Trenton's streets made their formations impossible to maintain. As they struggled to deploy in parade ground order, Captain Thomas Forrest's artillery opened fire from Queen Street, raking their ranks with canister shot that killed and wounded dozens in the first few seconds of the engagement. Colonel Raoul, finally grasping the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around him, attempted to rally his men for a counterattack that might break through the American encirclement. The veteran Hessian officer, despite his condition from the previous night's celebrations, retained enough military instinct to recognize that his only hope lay in concentrated force applied at a single point. He ordered the Raoul Regiment to fix bayonets and charge directly up King Street toward Hamilton's guns, gambling that European discipline could overcome American firepower through sheer audacity and professional skill. The bayonet charge became one of the most desperate and tragic episodes of the entire Revolutionary War. 300 Hessian grenadiers, their bright uniforms making perfect targets against the winter landscape, advanced in perfect formation directly into the muzzles of Hamilton's cannons. These were men who had never retreated from any battlefield, soldiers whose pride and training demanded that they face death rather than surrender their colors to colonial rebels. Their courage was magnificent and utterly futile against the concentrated fire of artillery loaded with grapeshot at point-blank range. General Washington himself rode into the thick of the fighting, his white horse and commanding presence visible throughout the battle, as he directed his men with the calm precision of a chess master moving pieces across a board. Private Robert Monroe of the Virginia 3rd Regiment later wrote in his diary that the general seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing wherever the fighting was fiercest and the need for leadership most critical. According to contemporary accounts in the Boston Gazette, Washington's personal example under fire inspired his men to feats of courage that surprised even their own officers. The Lawsburg Regiment made a final attempt to escape the trap by forming square and fighting their way toward the Assumpkink Creek Bridge, where they hoped to join with British reinforcements from Princeton. Captain John Starks, New Hampshire rifleman, positioned in houses overlooking the creek, turned the retreat into a massacre as they picked off Hessian officers with the accuracy that made American marksmen famous throughout Europe. The disciplined withdrawal became a rout as panic spread through ranks unused to fighting an enemy that refused to meet them in open battle according to accepted rules of warfare. Within 45 minutes of the first shot, organized Hessian resistance had collapsed entirely. The survivors found themselves surrounded, cut off from escape routes, and facing American soldiers, whose desperation had transformed them from a beaten rabble into an unstoppable force of revolutionary fury. The moment when Europe's military supremacy met America's innovative warfare had arrived, and the outcome would reshape the balance of power in the New World forever. Colonel Johann Raoul fell mortally wounded at the climax of his regiment's desperate charge, struck down by musket balls that ended both his life and his soldiers' last hope of organized resistance. The veteran Hessian commander, his bright uniform now stained with blood, was carried from the field by his remaining officers, as American forces closed in from all directions. His death marked the psychological collapse of the Hessian garrison. Men who had never known defeat suddenly found themselves leaderless and surrounded in a foreign land far from home. Major Johann Matthaus, assuming command of the shattered Hessian forces, faced an impossible situation that no amount of European military training had prepared him to handle. His men were scattered throughout Trenton, some still fighting from houses and shops, while others had already begun laying down their arms in surrender. The rigid command structure that made Hessian armies so effective on European battlefields had disintegrated under the pressure of street fighting against an enemy that refused to follow conventional rules of engagement. The surrender began spontaneously as individual Hessian soldiers, seeing no hope of escape or reinforcement, emerged from their positions with white flags improvised from torn shirts and handkerchiefs. Captain William Washington's cavalry had sealed off the roads leading east toward Princeton, while Sullivan's men controlled the southern approaches to the Assunpink Creek. The trap was complete, and the professional soldiers who had crossed an ocean to suppress the American rebellion found themselves prisoners of the very rebels they had been sent to defeat. General Washington, recognizing the propaganda value of mercy toward defeated enemies, ordered his men to treat the Hessian prisoners with dignity and respect. This decision, while controversial among Continental soldiers who had suffered greatly at the hands of European mercenaries, demonstrated the revolutionary ideals that separated the American cause from traditional European warfare, according to reports later published in the Pennsylvania Journal. Washington personally visited the wounded Hessians and ensured they received the same medical care as his own men. The material gains from the victory at Trenton proved almost as valuable as the psychological impact. The Continental Army captured nearly 900 prisoners, 6 artillery pieces, 40 horses, and enormous quantities of small arms and ammunition that Washington's forces desperately needed. Perhaps more importantly, they seized the Hessian regimental colors, symbols of European military pride that would become powerful propaganda tools in rallying American support for the revolutionary cause. Captain Hamilton's accurate artillery fire had been decisive in breaking Hessian resistance, but the young officer's most important contribution came in the battle's aftermath. His careful inventory of captured supplies revealed that the Continental Army had acquired enough muskets and ammunition to properly equip nearly 1,000 additional soldiers. The powder alone, stored in the Hessian magazines, represented more than the Continental Congress had been able to provide in the previous 6 months of warfare. The transformation in Continental Army morale was immediate and dramatic. Men who had crossed the Delaware as defeated refugees now stood as victorious soldiers, who had proven they could defeat Europe's finest professional troops. Private James McMichael of the Pennsylvania 5th Regiment wrote to his family that the victory at Trenton had convinced him and his comrades that independence was not only possible but inevitable. Given sufficient determination and proper leadership, news of the victory spread through the American colonies with unprecedented speed, carried by riders who covered impossible distances to bring word of Washington's triumph to communities that had begun to lose hope in the revolutionary cause. The Virginia Gazette reported that spontaneous celebrations broke out in towns throughout the colonies as word spread that the Continental Army had achieved its first major victory against European professional soldiers. Church bells rang from Boston to Charleston, and recruitment for the Continental Army increased dramatically as young men rushed to join what now appeared to be a winning cause. The strategic implications extended far beyond American shores. As European observers began to reassess their assumptions about colonial military capabilities, French officials already considering intervention in support of American independence saw the Battle of Trenton as evidence that the Continental Army could potentially defeat British forces with proper training and equipment. The victory marked the beginning of a diplomatic revolution that would ultimately bring European allies to the American cause and transform a colonial rebellion into a global war for independence. The aftermath of victory revealed both the triumph and the terrible cost of Washington's desperate gamble at Trenton. As Continental soldiers moved through the streets collecting weapons and tending to the wounded, the full magnitude of their achievement began to dawn on men who had crossed the Delaware expecting to die for their cause. They had not merely won a battle, they had proven that American soldiers could defeat the finest professional troops that Europe could send against them. The casualty reports told a story that seemed almost miraculous to contemporaries familiar with the brutal arithmetic of 18th-century warfare. The Continental Army had suffered only 4 wounded men during the entire engagement, while the Hessians had lost 22 killed, 83 wounded, and nearly 900 captured. Captain William Washington and Lieutenant James Monroe, future President of the United States, were among the American wounded. But their injuries proved minor compared to the devastation inflicted upon the enemy forces. The weather that had nearly destroyed Washington's army during the river crossing now became their salvation, as British reinforcements from Princeton found the roads impassable due to ice and snow. General Charles Cornwallis, awakened at his winter quarters with news of the disaster at Trenton, ordered an immediate counterattack, but discovered that his troops could not march in conditions that had allowed Washington's desperate men to achieve complete surprise. The nor'easter that had tortured the Continental Army throughout their Christmas night march continued to shield them from British retaliation. Dr. Benjamin Rush, arriving with the Continental Congress medical supplies that had been promised for months, found the American wounded receiving better care than many had known since enlisting in the Army. The captured Hessian medical supplies, combined with warm quarters in Trenton's houses, provided luxuries that Continental soldiers had nearly forgotten existed. For the first time in months, Washington's men slept in beds, ate hot meals, and wore dry clothing taken from enemy stores. The logistical challenge of managing nearly 900 prisoners tested the Continental Army's limited resources, but provided unexpected opportunities for intelligence gathering. Many of the captured Hessians, professional soldiers with no personal loyalty to the British cause, proved willing to share information about British troop dispositions and future plans in exchange for fair treatment. Some even expressed interest in switching sides, though Washington declined to enlist former enemies in his ranks. The psychological transformation extended beyond the Continental Army to affect civilian morale throughout the colonies. Reports from contemporary newspapers, including detailed accounts in the New York Packet, described spontaneous celebrations in communities that had spent months in despair over British military successes. The victory at Trenton provided concrete proof that the Continental Army could win battles against professional European soldiers, reviving hope that independence remained achievable despite previous setbacks. Washington faced an immediate strategic dilemma that would test his leadership as severely as the battle itself. His army's enlistments expired on December 31st, just 6 days after the victory, meaning that most of his soldiers could legally abandon the cause and return home. The general gathered his men in Trenton streets and delivered what many historians consider one of the most important speeches in American history. Appealing to their patriotism and their pride in what they had accomplished together, the response exceeded Washington's most optimistic expectations as hundreds of Continental soldiers agreed to extend their enlistments for 6 additional weeks, accepting the promise of a $10 bounty that the Continental Congress had no money to pay. These men, who had every legal and moral right to go home after months of suffering and sacrifice, chose instead to continue fighting for a cause that had seemed hopeless just days earlier. Their decision would make possible the follow-up victory at Princeton and establish the Continental Army as a permanent force capable of sustained resistance against British occupation. The international implications of Trenton extended far beyond North America. As European observers began to recalculate the likelihood of American success in their war for independence, French Foreign Minister Charles Gravier, Count of Vergennes, cited the battle as evidence that American forces could achieve military victories that might justify French intervention in support of the revolutionary cause. The victory marked the beginning of diplomatic negotiations that would eventually bring French military and naval support to the Continental Army. The Battle of Trenton concluded with a transformation that extended far beyond military victory into the realm of national identity and revolutionary consciousness. As Washington's army prepared to recross the Delaware with their prisoners and captured supplies, they carried with them something more valuable than artillery or ammunition: the knowledge that American soldiers could stand against the world's finest military forces and emerge victorious through courage, innovation, and determination. The strategic brilliance of Washington's Christmas night attack lay not merely in its tactical success, but in its timing and psychological impact. The victory came at precisely the moment when the revolutionary cause appeared to be collapsing under the weight of military defeats and political discord. The Continental Congress had fled Philadelphia, enlistments were expiring, and public support for independence had reached its lowest point since the Declaration had been signed 6 months earlier. Trenton reversed this decline and provided the foundation for continued resistance. The ripple effects of victory spread through American society with unprecedented speed and intensity. Recruitment for the Continental Army increased dramatically as young men who had hesitated to join what appeared to be a losing cause now rushed to enlist in an army that had proven its ability to defeat professional European soldiers. State governments that had been reluctant to provide supplies and support suddenly discovered renewed enthusiasm for the Revolutionary War effort. The captured Hessian battle flags became powerful symbols of American military capability that were displayed in towns throughout the colonies to encourage enlistment and financial support for the war effort. These colors, representing centuries of European military tradition, now served as proof that American forces could triumph over any enemy sent against them. The psychological impact of seeing enemy battle standards in American hands proved as valuable as any military supplies captured during the battle. European reaction to the news from Trenton marked a fundamental shift in international perceptions of the American Revolution. What had previously been viewed as a colonial uprising destined for rapid suppression was now recognized as a legitimate war of independence, fought by soldiers capable of achieving significant military victories. French officials accelerated their negotiations for formal alliance with the American cause, while British military planners were forced to reassess their assumptions about the war's duration and probable outcome. The personal transformation of Continental Army soldiers proved as significant as the broader strategic implications of victory. Men who had crossed the Delaware as defeated refugees returned as victorious warriors who had accomplished what many considered impossible. The shared experience of enduring extreme hardship followed by unprecedented triumph created bonds of unit cohesion that would sustain the Continental Army through 6 additional years of warfare against superior enemy forces. General Washington's leadership during the Trenton campaign established his reputation as a military commander capable of achieving victory. Against overwhelming odds, through careful planning, personal courage, and innovative tactics, the Christmas night crossing and dawn attack became legendary examples of American military ingenuity that inspired future generations of soldiers facing seemingly impossible challenges. According to historical analysis published in the American Historical Review, Washington's decision to attack Trenton demonstrated strategic thinking that combined European military knowledge with uniquely American approaches to warfare. The Battle of Trenton ultimately represented more than a tactical victory or strategic turning point. It marked the moment when the American Revolution transformed from a political protest into a genuine war of independence fought by soldiers who believed in their cause and their ability to achieve victory. The men who recrossed the Delaware on December 26th were fundamentally different from those who had made the original crossing 24 hours earlier. They had become Americans in the fullest sense of the word. The legacy of that Christmas night attack extended through centuries of American history, inspiring soldiers in subsequent wars who faced similar moments of crisis and desperation. The image of Washington crossing the Delaware became one of the most enduring symbols of American determination and courage, representing the principle that free people fighting for their liberty could overcome any obstacle through sacrifice, innovation, and unwavering commitment to their cause. In the frozen streets of Trenton, on that December morning in 1776, the United States of America was truly born through fire, ice, and the indomitable will of men who refused to surrender their dreams of freedom.